VTT.
Hell yeah.
Self-hosting Foundry VTT in the cloud part 2. So hey guys, this is the second part of a tutorial on how to get started on DigitalOcean to set up Foundry on the cloud, self-hosting it with a 24/7 always on Foundry VTT installation. And we will start that with a little bit of dry information on how we need to prepare for that. Because if you're using Windows and haven't been using Linux for a while, you might not know some of the stuff, like how do we actually authenticate to a server? Because we are not using, like, let me skip to the next page. We will not be using a username and password combination. DigitalOcean offers us to do that, but it's rather insecure. And let's dive into that a little bit to give you some context. So basically, when you're using username and password authentication, people always tend to use simple to guess passwords, which can be cracked and which is in general not super secure. So instead, what we will be using is by creating a key pair that consists of a public key and a private key. And we will manage those keys very, very differently, but they will work together to provide a secure and easy to use authentication scheme, which can be easily cracked, or no routes around that if we configure a server correctly. And on Windows, this is starting to appear, having support for public key, like generate a public and private key pair and use that, and use SSH to connect to a remote server. That started really to appear natively, provided by Microsoft, beginning with Windows 10. Before that, there were other alternatives. For example, PuTTY was a very common program to use, PuTTY and PuTTYGen to generate keys. But nowadays, I would not recommend using those softwares because it's a little bit outdated and you will have to work around certain stuff. And having it built in within Windows is way easier to work with. That's it. So we will enable or install an optional component which is normally disabled when you install Windows regularly, but which can be easily enabled. We will see that in a second. But let's talk about public key and private key, because for most users coming from Windows, this is really uncommon. If you're working with Linux, that's pretty broadly used everywhere, basically, but at least from my experience. But if you are using Windows, you normally just use username and password authentication and other stuff that is underlying that, like Kerberos tickets, if you're talking about Windows domains, which is not related to this video, but very different worlds. And let's see what it is actually. So basically there are two text files. When you create a public key, you cannot just create a public key, you always create a pair using some kind of command line utility or other utility. And we'll use certain algorithm to encrypt both parts, so private and public key pair, and you can use the public key to store it basically wherever you want. You give it around freely. It is meant to be public, hence the name. And you can store it, for example, all the servers that you want to authenticate to. You can basically create some kind of mail client that encrypts contents by having a big repository of public keys, and everyone has their own private key held securely. So this is the second part. The private key, you need to really make sure that no one gets ever access to your private key files, to the text file, because if I can copy your private key, I can basically provide that to authenticate to your Foundry server. And the server will say, okay, that's the right key, you're granted access. So this is a bit like a password. And on top of that, you can actually create a password on top of this private key. So even if I manage to copy your key, during authentication, the client will say, okay, this private key is password protected, please install passphrase. And if you don't know that, it's just an additional layer of security on top of that, and it's recommended to do that. So with using one of those standard algorithms that is used nowadays, it's pretty secure and cannot be cracked, at least not in reasonable amounts of time. And This will probably change when we work on like all these supercomputers, which are not working like regular computers, but with different states of atoms and all that weird stuff that sounds like fantasy. But right now, that's the most recommended way to secure a server on the internet from malicious parties that try to get access and use your server resources for their means. And please do not use a username password. We will be generating these keys in a second, the later part of this tutorial, and you will see how easy it is to work with. But let's dig a bit in how it's actually done. So we generate this key pair, public key and private key, and then we will just supply the public key onto the server, and it will be saved in a file called authorized keys. And when you try to log in using SSH, so SSH will create a connection to your server, and it says, okay, I've got this private key file, is that okay? So authorization scheme, and then the SSH server will look at this configuration, say, okay, public key authentication is enabled, so yeah, that's good. Then we'll take a look at the authorized key, so which private keys can actually authorize here, and if it finds your public key in there, you're golden. It might be, again, that you will ask to entering a passphrase, so the password on top of the private key file, which again is recommended, and then you are logged in using SSH from your Windows computer to your Linux server in the cloud. And you can start installing software, managing a Foundry VTT server, uploading assets, everything you can do from the command line can be done then. So that's cool, that's what we want. Again, if your private key is compromised, so anyone had access to it, you can always remove your entry in the authorized key file, regenerate a new key pair, and provide that to the authorized key. So then you can roll back, so the key is invalidated, and you can just use a new key if that ever happens. So that's pretty easy to do also. So how do we install this optional feature that I talked about earlier? I always just hit the Windows prompt key and start typing in, like when I type in optional, it already says manage optional features, and I just hit enter to open this dialog. And you will see here, it's split basically in the top part. You can add features, which you probably will do if you didn't do that already. And if you then type in the search bar SSH, it will provide you with an open SSH client. Here you can see that I already installed that. By adding a feature and typing in SSH, there will be 2 entries. And the open SSH server is something that we do not need. This is needed if you want to run an SSH server that other people can connect to. But if you just want to use your Windows machine to connect to other SSH servers, we just need the client. The client provides the SSH utility, it provides the command line prompts to create a new key pair and use that key pair. So that's all we need on this section here. So go to optional features, manage optional features, and hit add feature, select for SSH, and install the SSH client. So this one, open SSH client. And then you're good. Great. So let's do exactly that. I just hit the Windows key that opens up the start menu, and if you just start typing in the lower bottom search key here, you can just execute the programs. That's my way of doing that. You can do it, of course, as you wish. And we will be opening a Powershell. Powershell is the new command line utility from Windows, and we will be using that for creating SSH connections and all that stuff. So this is basically different. In the past, it was the command prompt. It looks a little bit like the same. You can see there. But basically, PowerShell is the way to do it on Windows nowadays, and the command prompt were the old days. So let's use PowerShell from now on. And you can feel like a hacker because now let's do command line stuff for the very first time in this tutorial. We installed the optional feature, as I told you before, and we will be starting our quest in this C user Sabbath directory. You can see here, and if we go to like here, so this is Windows Explorer, And let's go just to the documents folder, and you can see it's just documents here. You can go and insert C:\users sebas. And this is the directory that my user's data is stored in. And I think you should be user home. Let's see. Now I'm here. A little bit of doing some guesswork. I show home. Now that's not it. So I'm not really sure how to do that on Windows. So let's try not to impress anyone. So we will be going in here, just going to C and to users and then to your users directory. And we will create a directory called .ssh here. This is probably not existing here. And OpenSSH will expect certain options and configuration files in this directory, and it's great if we start that here. So if it does not exist, I would suggest you creating that. So on the command line here, let's clear that. You can always use mkdir, so make directory .ssh, and the leading dot is pretty important. Perhaps let's make that a little bit bigger. Is pretty important because on Linux, the leading dot will hide directory by default from a directory listing, and OpenSSH client is working very closely with Linux, and we try to replicate some of the things on Windows 2 to just make no transition necessary between how OpenSSH functions on Windows versus it functions on Linux. So start with this command to create a new directory, or go to the Windows Explorer, head to the users, your username folder, right click here and create a new folder and call it .ssh. And if you hit enter, it will create that folder. Here it says, hey, this is already existing. Do you want to replace that? I will hit no here, but you will just create a new folder called .ssh. And once that is done, you're ready to go to the next step. So I will delete this new folder and we go here. And the first thing that we need to do is now generate a new SSH key. And this is as easy as entering SSH-keygen. And now it starts already. And it says generating a private public key, RSA key pair. RSA is the algorithm used. I talked about that earlier. That's the encryption model or algorithm that is underlying this key pair. And if you're using RSA, that's pretty great. If I ask me now, where do you want to save this key? And you can see it's referencing to this sabels.ssh folder we just created. So it's good that it already exists, and that's the name of the key file. And for Windows users, that's a bit odd because there's no file extension, and that's pretty common in Linux too. So the ID_RSA, it's the default private key file name for generating a new key, and I will replace that because I already got a private key with that name. I do not want to overwrite it. You can name it as you wish. So for my example, I will now use, and I'm not sure, let's try one thing. I don't know if the default directory is here or if I need to specify the complete directory. I will just try to create a new key but just using a file name to see how it ends up. And I will just use VTT tutorial. That's all. And now it asks for a passphrase, or we can just skip that by hitting enter without entering passphrase. And this is the password that you need to enter when you are using the private key. I would recommend doing something here, even if it's not very, very large or very, very secure. It would just create an additional layer of security. So just in case your private key file goes to the wrong hands, there's still this, okay, I need a password to use it. So it's a good thing to do. Okay, I entered the passphrase twice, and it says your identification has been saved to fvtt-tutorial, and the public key file is saved in fvtt-tutorial.pub. So without the ending is private key, .pub is the public key. The key fingerprint is, that's something, a random art image that is used to feed the algorithm to really get some very randomized stuff in there. And let's have a look where it was saved. So let's list everything that starts with FVTT, And we can see that I already did a Foundry VTT public key pair. So in the first part where I recorded this tutorial, and this is the new one that we just have created here. So that's the private key and the public key, and we can see without specifying a directory, it will just use the directory the command was issued in. So it just stored in here and not in the .sh folder. And we will move that now. So we move all files with the mv command for moving, and we specify, in my case, this everything starting with fvtt dash. Yeah, that's good. So this will match those two files here, and we will move everything in the .sh folder. And it says, can I create something that already exists? Let's do it like that. Doesn't work too. So what is going on? Let's and why isn't it going to the end here? Let's see what's happened. Okay, they've been moved there. That's okay. Probably some kind of mishap from my end. So we've got these two files now in this folder, and we're good to go. Now we can actually use these, and to actually use these, we have to copy them to a service on the internet in the authorized key file. And with DigitalOcean, it's very easy because you basically upload your public key onto the control panel from DigitalOcean, and when you create a new virtual machine, it will ask you which SSH key files do you want to supply to the server. So it's already done for you by creating or when creating a new server. So let's look at that. So when you log in into DigitalOcean for the first time, you will not see this dashboard, but you will have some kind of nice image, and on the top right side it will say take me to the dashboard. If you click that, you will see something like that. And what we need to do is, here we need to go to, and let me see, because it's a little bit hidden, and I was just making sure that I do the same thing. Okay, it's here. So settings and security will take us to SSH keys and the possibility to add a new SSH key here. So I already registered 3 of those, and let's just add the one that we just created. And there are some instructions on how to do that, and they recommend PuTTY. Again, I would use the integrated Windows 10 OpenSSH keygen for doing that, because PuTTY has some kind of outdated issues here. It will generate keys on an outdated part, and you need to convert them. It's pretty hacky, in my opinion. It works, but you need to know more about how to make it work. And this is the easiest way to actually create a key pair. So we already did that, and we just need to add the SSH key content in here, and that's the public key. So that's very important. Do not paste the private key here. We need to paste the public key. And we selected here, so we saw that .pub was the public key, and we will open that with Notepad, and you will see it's just a very long line of gibberish for us, but for computers it makes perfect sense. So what we do is we hit Control A for select everything, Control C to copy everything we had over here, and we paste it in here, and you can see how many characters there already are. And we name that key file now in order to be able to deactivate a key that has been compromised. We need to have a speaking name, and I would just use the VTT installer tutorial to make sure that I will clean that up later, because I don't want to have that available showcasing everything on YouTube and then having it in production is a bad idea. So always make sure that you do not make something public that you do not intend to. Even if it's just a public key and we can basically do that, it's still cleaning up is a great way to not get overburdened with digital trash. So let's add this SSH key, and it says, okay, SSH key created successfully. It will be now displayed over here, and from now on we can use it to create a new droplet. and which is a virtual machine, we come to that later, and provide this SSH public key right into our server, so we can use that from connecting it with SSH later on. And let's do that really quick without going into the details of what I will be doing here. So let's create a new droplet, and we will just take the defaults for everything. I will not go into any of these options right now because we will do that later. The important part is here, authentication, SSH keys, a more secure authentication method. Yes, I agree. Or you can use password, create a root password to access droplet. Less secure, I agree here too. So we use the SSH key we just created, and we'll select this one over here. We'll create one droplet, I don't care what it's named, and let's create that droplet. And you see it's pretty fast, but what I want to show you here is something that is stored in this .ssh folder also, because it is a config over here. And if we open that with Notepad, where is it? Open with, where are you? Let's open with code. So it's just a text file, as you can see here. And there we can create configuration that makes it easier for us to handle all these things. So what we do here is, first we just copy that complete thing, or we create a new one so it's indented properly. The first line is basically starting a new block, and I use that tutorial, install tutorial. That's some name that you are basically thinking out for yourself. You just need to remember it to make the connection. Okay, I want to connect to this host, and we will be using this SSH key for connections, and what we need is the IP address. So the droplet has been created already. We will use the IP address here. We can use the domain name afterwards. We authenticate as user root, which is the administrator in Linux lingo. We said we prefer authentication using the public key scheme versus the username password, and use the identifier. Now this is the link to the private key, and we said our private key name is VTT tutorial, so we use that. It is stored in my user directory in the .ssh folder, and it's called VTT tutorial. So we specify the private key, and said add keys to agent. Yes, that's not something that you do not need to be concerned with right now. So we save that, and now we can do something very, very nifty. We copy that because that's the name, and we can use something very, very less verbose. For example, just FVTT. Let's use just FVTT. I resave that file and I close the editor. And what we can do now, it is running already, so it has been created. We go back to our beloved Powershell, and now we can just say SSH and FVTT. And now the magic is already happening. And it says, okay, the authenticator of host IP address can't be established. We do not know about this server. Do we want to trust them? This is something that is important. If you hit that now, yes, I trust them, because we know this is a new server we created and we want to connect to that, absolutely. And this message should appear only once. If for some reason this message will appear somewhere down in the future, hey, the authenticator of the host can't be established, you automatically know, hey, something is fishy here, because I trusted this server once again, and now his fingerprint changed, so someone tried to f with me. And that's a good message. Now we know, new server, unknown to us, yes, we trust this server. And now it's basically saved in our database of servers. We trust this one, but it's fingerprinted, and if the server identity changes, this message will reappear, and we know something is wrong here. And we enter our passphrase, and here we go. Now we are not longer on a local machine. You can see that is PowerShell. This is the Windows drive, and now we are authenticated as the root server at our host here, which we didn't care to specify a nice looking name. So this is Debian S, is 1 vCPU, 1 GB of RAM. It's located in Frankfurt. It is -01. So that's the host name that has been generated for that. And now we are here on Linux. And we can say IP address show. So let's look at the IP address and the configuration and all that stuff. So now we are really working on our cloud server where we can install stuff and everything. And then one thing that we will do now is we will already add some little bit of security, because we will edit the SSH server running on this virtual machine. Because if we go to, and this is stored in SSH, as etc SSH, we will have some kind of configs here. And one is called SSHD for daemon, so the service that is waiting for incoming connections, and _config. So the whole path would be etc SSHD for daemon and _config. That's the complete path. So if we edit that, and my go-to editor is always Nano, which is installed here, we can see some of the options that we can configure using for making it a little bit more secure. And you see that all these pound signs are comments, so basically everything is commented out here, and we can go through it, and there are some explanations. And what we do is, so let's go very, very quickly over it. We will be, let me see where it is, authentication, permit root login, yes, we will do that. A more secure way would be to create a new user and say root access is not allowed to log in using SSH. So that would be even more perfect. But with our level of security, we're already restricted with the public-private key pair. This is pretty good already. But we can say yes, pub key authentication is set to yes. And let's see, I think there was something else. Host based, ignore our host. And password authentication, no. So we will not allow password authentication. It's already set, probably because we selected to provide an SSH key during droplet creation. But we can explicitly say public key authentication, please support that. So that's pretty secure in default. We do not need to actually do anything here, but I just want to show that. And now we need to start the SSH servers again to reflect our changes. So servers, SSHD, the daemon powering SSH should restart, and now we're good to go. That's some of the things that we can do to make the server a little bit better. And this has been wrapping up how do we connect to a Linux server from our Windows host. What do we need to prepare to be able to create a new public and private key pair? What is it actually good for, and why is it better than password authentication? How do we supply the private key or the public key to DigitalOcean in order to use that when we create a new server? And how do we need to configure our local SSH client to make life a little bit easier? So we can exit this session now with exit, and we are back on our Windows machine. So pretty awesome. Pretty awesome. We covered again much ground. I hope I explained some new concept to you, something a little bit more clear. And in the next video, we will start to actually make the server a little bit more secure on top of the things that we already did. And then we started installing software, and we make our service, our Foundry server, be running in the cloud for us in the next step of our tutorial. See you soon. Bye-bye.